Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri. Today we're going to talk about a video I made a little while back, and I made some commentary that I think quant finance is dead. Let me just give you the really quick short answer so that most of you who are looking for that quick make you feel good kind of answer here. The industry itself is always going to exist. There's always going to be jobs. So if you go, you get a degree, you get a job, you'll have a job. We can rubber stamp you with the little desirable quant stamp on the side of you. And you can go on happily go lucky and think like the world is rainbows and butterflies and you're doing simple things. That's fine. Go ahead and do that. We'll put you over there. If you're in that boat, you can now close the video and go worry about checking a few more boxes here. But let's get into this video in itself. I've already shot this video twice. They've both been over 30 minutes, some close to an hour. One of them's close to an hour. But why do I think the quant finance industry has been dying for a long time? We've taken a wrong turn. We don't seem to be able to get back on course. And there's a lot of driving factors, and it's really this spider web. So imagine like a spider web where all the parts are feeding each other. And so as we have deviated from the original course of using the scientific method to solve financial problems, which is what quantitative finance realistically is, using math and stats applied to finance using computer science. That's quant finance. Every other job around that is other jobs, software engineers, data structure, data governance, finance, trading, operations, all other departments that interact with, guess what? The quants. So let's just define quants right up front, which is what I just said. It's math and stats applied to financial problems. Again, utilizing programming to do this. This is what we do. A business brings us a problem. We take data, so we have to go out, find the data, work with the data teams, look at data quality, fill in stuff if we need to, go through painstaking theoretical considerations on how we fill missing data, why we fill missing data, all that. Build out some sort of solution. Again, quants, I would argue, using higher end mathematics and statistics to solve complex problems. If you are taking data and you're fitting just for parameters on something that pre-exists, you don't need to be a quant for that. You don't need the scientific method to calibrate a model. Like calibrating a model that you pull off the shelf, it's not quant finance. That's just business analytics or traditional finance. That's one of the key issues I'm going to talk about here is skills determine jobs. Not titles that companies apply to them or students or grad departments or universities or you put on yourself to make yourself feel good. We have ended up, I think, in a feel good, pat yourself on the back mentality, which is part of this problem here. But more or less, that's what's happening is that quant finance is applying math and stats to solve some sort of complex problem and then solving the problem for the end user, the business person. That could be a trader, which everyone likes to talk about, which I think has ruined the industry by focusing too much on trading. But the majority of the industry is doing engineering of products, moving products around, optimizing portfolios for, consumer or corporate values, hedging risk. So risk has become a dirty word in the quant space. Everyone says, oh, you're in risk management. That's not really the quant space here. And I'll get into why I think that's complete nonsense. One of those being we think stochastic calculus is the pinnacle and derivative pricing is the pinnacle of what quant finance is, which I think is a very outdated ideology. But yet again, that's just risk management. Derivatives are just hedging risk. They're risk hedging, dividing up risk within a product and reattributing that risk to different parties. So risk management is just quant finance. The rest of it, the investing side, the making money side, that has nothing to do with being a quant. And that's another part of this issue as well. So anyways, quant finance should be defined based on the skills and it should be applying the scientific method to finance. That's it. Now let's jump into the different parts and pieces of this puzzle and problem and try to tie them together as best I can, as coherently as I can, without rambling on, because past videos I have kind of tried to cover it and I feel like I'm covering too many things simultaneously and then repeating myself. So let's just start off here with the education system to start with. The education system sucks and it's broken. You could apply this probably to multiple fields outside of quant finance. If you would like, you can draw conclusions, parallels and all that. But quant finance in itself has gotten off the rails on what they are teaching and what is actually useful here. So now, is this an industry problem feeding academia or an academia problem feeding the industry? You can make your own sort of conclusions on that. But let me just say the curriculum that most programs are teaching are extremely outdated. The programs are not teaching useful tools for people to actually use the scientific method. Even like experimental design and basic research methodologies, like how you set things up and work. And finance is unique. I get it. I had an applied economics master, so I understand financial data quite well and how many things that you want to test in kind of a traditional experimental design and an academic perspective is not how you do things in finance and economics. But understanding biases and how you set up experiments and how you truly have a hypothesis and how you go through the testing process, that's really what we're supposed to be doing. And then simultaneously trying to solve problems as we go through this approach. It's a little bit challenging, a little bit unique. This isn't being really taught anywhere. I haven't seen it being taught, which is why a lot of firms prefer to hire PhDs, because they have to go through that process. They have to learn the research process with that. So anyways, the curriculum is outdated. I'm going to start with the first thing being stochastic calculus. So again, stochastic calculus, when I say that, is a very generalized math concept. I have no issue with that. But if you were to prioritize the skills that were used in the industry, the vast majority of people currently in this industry are not using derivative pricing with the Black-Scholes structure and design. I'm being very specific because even stochastic calculus is this big behemoth thing. We don't teach stochastic calculus in most, if not all, the Quant Masters programs. What you were teaching is how to use stochastic calculus for the Black-Scholes model on European options. And then we deviate into American options, and then we'll deviate into some other cases and relax some of the settings and go through the process of how we kind of unravel Black-Scholes into something more practical and feasible, but then you need to get into numerical methods and tie into other tools. It's great. But the reality is most of us are not going to be pricing derivative products, especially on some sort of rigorous level here, especially in exotics. And again, there are jobs that do that. I'm not saying those don't exist. There are pocketed jobs that do that. But when you go through and you look at, for example, everybody today, if you made like a big list of everyone who says, I'm a quant, you said, great, let's put a list together. I'm going to say 90% of you aren't really quants, but let's pretend you all are. And we'll go through this process here. And we'll ask you how many of you are using stochastic calculus to derivative pricing, or more generally just stochastic calculus, right? I'm going to hear crickets, to be honest with you guys. I've been to firm after firm after firm and talked to industry practitioners across the board. And a lot of them will say, well, we use, like Markov processes, which is stochastic processes. I'm like, that's fine. But if you are not doing stochastic calculus specifically, that's what I'm trying to get at as the question here. So I think it is very outdated to teach it. I think part of this comes from the fact that we have lost the scientific rigor. So back in, I think it's like 79, 78, somewhere around there, maybe 76, Fisher Black and Myron Schultz came out with the Black-Scholes model. Robert Merton added his mathematical perspective to it, increased it, made it a little more interesting to understand, a little more interesting to implement, and it had other implications that came out of that process. But that occurred back in the late 70s. And yet we are like clinging to it for dear life. Like, Dimitri, if we don't teach this, we're not really quants. Forget the entire other mathematic field of studies. Even things as simple as like Monte Carlo simulation, but doing it more rigorously through like a numerical methods, like more of just like a math, like a pure math perspective on some of these things sometimes. So you can applied math, pure math, looking at these things though from a more academic-y level of how you're going to go through solving financial problems here. And the weirdest part of this is going through graduate school. I can tell you back in 2012 to 2014, that was the weird realization after like 5 years in a career. I was like, wow, statistics was so much more useful. Simple linear regression and understanding much deeper, not like the financial factor modeling. This is a factor and, this is our alpha. No, this is just stupid. And it drives me insane because we've taken math and stats and we've dumbed things down and just butchered things up. Anyways, we are clinging to it with dear life. And I think it is one of those things that is interesting that could be an elective, but I think the shift needs to go back towards, again, learning math and stats and machine learning, which is part of statistics, to enhance our tools that we have to solve financial problems. Like that's what we're being hired to do, is solve these financial problems. I can tell you the vast majority of problems, stochastic calculus is not being used to solve them. So that is what it is. That is, I think, one of the big issues. Now, the curriculum has been off the rails as I'm going around to different programs, talking to students, talking to alumni over the last, 12 years now. It has been clear that a lot of what is being taught is just a scattering of nonsensical, high-level things, which brings me to the issue of mini masters, which is students will say, Dimitri, why am I going to take all these classes at, this school? I've already taken, let's say numerical methods, or I've already taken, derivative pricing in my undergrad. And it's like, one of the problems we're failing as an industry on the graduate levels, these graduate programs are no longer academic masters. They have become professional degrees. And as many of you know, I have almost zero respect for an MBA because an MBA is literally the same education you took as an undergrad. And I'm telling you that as someone who's taken financial classes from one of the top 10, top 20 MBA programs in the US, same classes as my generic no-name state school. So we have watered down and taken undergrad courses and are charging a premium for this education as some sort of cutting edge master's program and relabeling this and teaching the same undergrad courses. Okay. You can teach, for example, something as simple as linear algebra at a high school level. You can teach it as a undergraduate level. You can teach it at a mastery level, and you can teach it at a PhD level. There's still research going on in these fields. And I think this is one of the things that's frustrating me as a whole is most people that don't get this when I talk about it, it's because you are an undergrad or less. Your education is so lacking. You haven't had to look at things from a very unique or challenging perspective to realize you could spend an entire career on one topic, digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's one of the things I realized after grad school, which is wow, I spent 2 years learning. At the end of it, there's an infinite number of topics I wanted to cover. I didn't have the time to cover them. And even the ones I had, I felt like the textbooks kind of rushed through lots of it and the classes rushed through it. I want to go 10 times deeper in all this. This is where these programs are failing though, is because a lot of them have recycled undergrad courses. A lot of the students and prospective students I've been talking to are well, it's just, I've already taken that class with a generic title. I've taken econometrics. I'm like, at what level? Well, I took it during my undergrad, so I know all of econometrics. And I'm I don't know where, I don't even know how to respond to that as a question or a comment of you think that there's only one textbook that you could just peruse through. And let's be honest, your class probably didn't cover the entire textbook. And you somehow are a god and know everything about that topic here. I think it's the Dunning-Kruger effect or whatever. You have a tiny bit of information, you think you know everything. Anyways, the master's programs, I think in many cases have done this. They have tried to add in, for example, I see programs adding a little bit of C++, and then they add in a little bit of Monte Carlo simulation and a little bit of derivative pricing and a little bit of capital markets and a hint of statistical knowledge. And of course, we're going to throw in some machine learning in there because that's all the rage these days. And so they add all this in here. At the end of the day, you know nothing about any of these topics, and so you can't actually use any of the tools cohesively. You're also unable to put all the pieces together here. One of the solutions I would like to see come out of this is I'd like to see programs stand up and be a little bit more, like an adult in this situation and say, you know what? We're going to take this type of student. We're going to create this type of quant out of it. And our curriculum is only going to do that. Every program I talk to says, oh, we're a general program. We have no focus. I'm and that's why you're failing across the board. So what's happening though is we're going out, we're trying to find students across the world. There are too many programs right now as well. Most of the students in these programs are not top tier, top notch, and I don't care which programs you go to. Most programs are not going out and hand selecting the world's best and the brightest and churning them into these extraordinary quants and, putting them in a rock tumbler of education and having some sort of diamond come out at the end of it. That's just not happening. There are a few. There's people across the board that this has happened to. I find really, really, really bright people, but it doesn't seem like there are any programs that are doing an extraordinary job at 90% of their students coming out of this program are rock stars that have these skills. And this creates an issue in a hiring manager such as myself, and I've hired is I can't go to a program and know that every student's going to come out with about this quality. So this is one of the key issues that's kind of happening here. So they're taking students, they're churning them through. Again, some programs are doing much, much better. Some programs are doing much, much worse. There is a variation in quality across programs. So please don't think they're all the same. They are not. There are night and day differences between many of the programs. But that being said, we're just taking people in, churning them, and then we need to hurry and find a job for them and place them at a job. That has been the goal of these programs because, let's face it, QuantNet and Risk.net have placed way too much focus on salary and job placement numbers. Again, there is zero validation occurring anywhere. There is none. The schools, many of them are trying their best to post the numbers they want to post. The rating agencies often leave it very hand-wavily, not very transparent. Schools are not willing to go to companies or mandate letters from students graduating with their salary numbers or their job placement. So let me give you an example of why this gets to be a gray area. And the programs aren't trying to screw you. At least most of them aren't. They're all trying their best to report things, but there's not transparency and there's not consistency across programs. And one of these big issues is, let's say you have 100 students graduate and you send out an email and say, hey, can you please let us know if you've got a job and what the salary range is? And let's just say 25 of those students don't respond to you at all. You just can't get a hold of the students that graduated, right? What do you do? Right? There's nothing you can do at that point. So when you go to report your data, you don't want to say like they're unemployed because that would make you look bad. But you also don't want to say they are employed because you don't know where they're employed or their salary numbers. So often we just exclude that amount of data, which, I mean, I get it. Like, what are you going to do? Maybe that should be reported as part of that transparency. You want more transparency? Tell me how many students didn't respond. But now you take 100 students, 25. If they didn't respond, I'm going to guess they're probably unemployed. So the remaining data you have, the 75%, even if all 75% or 75 students in this case get a job, you still have 25% unemployment. And this rubbed me the wrong way in many ways. It rubs the programs the wrong way, you guys. This isn't like the programs are mean and nasty. The programs are struggling with this. They're frustrated. They wish students would respond so they could get accurate numbers. There's not a lot of guidance going across the ratings for these things. It's a whole mess. The other part of this too is salaries are self-reported. So Dimitri, how much money did you make at graduation? I heard I made 2 million, maybe 3 million. And my bonus is another 400 million on top of that. That's what I made. There's no validation, you guys. There's very minimal validation going on in this. And I will say some programs I look at, they are very honest. We can go through and look at it. But other ones, you can even go and look at like Glassdoor's reporting. So Glassdoor, again, is more self-reporting. So still has the same issue. This isn't like the gold standard or anything. But you can look at them, or you can even go on some of the corporate websites will tell you their salary ranges. And so you can look and say, oh, quantitative researcher makes like 120 to like 180 or 210. And yet you have students or programs reporting, and again, they break the data up so you can't see which salary goes with which company, but they'll report a salary like 400,000 and you'll be looking at it trying to figure out like, it's possible. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's possible because that 400,000, again, some programs have practitioners that are 10 years into a career. So if I went back for a master's degree, my salary would blow out all the numbers out of the water. But I've been doing this for 12 years. So if I went back, got a degree and did it, there are a lot of other factors that play into this as well. My point being with this, though, is the ranking systems aren't great. And they help promote the fact that job placement and salaries matter. There is no, weights put on, are the students actually being placed in quantitative finance jobs, right? What if you have students that came with computer science degree? They got your master's in financial engineering, financial math, quant finance, whatever. And then they graduated and couldn't find a job at a hedge fund, but took a software engineering job at a hedge fund, or took a software engineering job at a tech firm, or took a software engineering job at a manufacturing company. I don't know, fill in the company. They're employed and they're making 160 coming out. Is that a fair comparison? Should you be reporting that in your data? Again, that's not the point. My point being, though, is a lot of these programs aren't preparing students for quantitative finance to make quality quantitative finance employees and contribute to the quant finance industry. And so this creates this massive issue, which is like we're taking students in, we're churning students out, but it's very, very hard to figure out where students are going, where they're not going, unless you get to sit down with some of the program directors, unless you get to chat with the graduates and alumni and you work with them over the years. And you get to have these deeper conversations to realize a lot of the students graduating out of programs are not going into quant jobs. A lot of them are going to quant adjacent jobs. A lot of them are going to consulting, accounting, marketing, tech. And again, how do you grade that and figure out what's going on here? I can tell you a lot of students that go to these programs aren't actually going into quantitative finance because the programs are not preparing students well for this. So this is a big issue. Now, let's go down the pipeline here and figure out why this is an issue and why, it's happening for a long time. This isn't like a new problem in the last 5-10 years. This is probably like 30-year problem. The issue is now you look at those students, they go into the industry. Let's say I go to a program, we'll pick it out, program ABC, ABC University. And you go to this program and they teach me business analytics. Exact same curriculum as the business analytics degree as an undergrad, not graduate level, so not a master's level. And nothing fancy, nothing really quant financy, but it does some things that are adjacent. Maybe it teaches you value at risk. It teaches from your finance classes. And you do some Monte Carlo simulation. You do some SQL, some data manipulation. Of course, we got to throw in some machine learning, but it's business analytics, okay? You take the class, you graduate, and you go and you get a job in the industry. And the industry says, wow, you're a financial engineer from ABC University or Quant Finance Masters, whatever. We're going to hire you. We bring you in. And you work and you kind of solve some problems. And they're like, wow, he's not stellar, but he's solving some problems and everything. And they kind of move you around a few times and you get some promotions and you do okay. And 15 years down the road, you're a director or like a managing director, and you've made it, you may be 20 years down the road, and you've made it into the senior role. But throughout your career, you've never generated really high quality quantitative solutions, but you have generated decent solutions, right? But there's really no one to judge the quality because maybe it's a firm that doesn't have a lot of quantitative rigor, scientific rigor. I can tell you before 2010, a lot of firms didn't have many PhDs. A lot of people didn't know what the scientific method was. Business schools don't really teach it. So a lot of banks, financial institutions just don't have that grounding unless they have a really strong quant culture or your senior leadership has a real interest in the scientific method and academia and some of that thing. It's not very common though. So you go through this and then you go to hire people. Who are you going to hire? People kind of like you, and you're going to go through that process in your mind. This is what quantitative finance is, and you have an idea of it. Now, I don't want to demean people and say like, I have the right view of it, right? I'd love to see people debate, chat about, like, let's create an open discussion on these. But if you're not really doing math and stats applied to it, and you're not trying to use the scientific method, to be honest with you, most jobs I see now that say quant finance are what I learned in my undergrad, in my finance degree from Washington State University. So then it begs the question, as rightfully so, should you even get a master's degree to start with, right? Why would you need a master's degree if the curriculum and education is the same? Again, going down to my fundamental piece here with my argument, which is skills matter, not job titles. So if we're learning these skills in an undergrad level and it's the same as a master's level, right, that might be something to think about. That's something to think about. But that now impacts the industry in this fact that you are churning out a lot of students. And let's say, let's just say be nice and say 25% of the graduates coming out of these programs are really high-end, qualified quants, really excited, do things amazing, and that's probably about what it is. But let's say 25% come out, and you have 75% that don't come out. Now, when they place them in non-quant jobs, that's actually a good thing. Their skills are probably aligning with other areas. They're going into the areas. But those that are really not that qualified and aren't, that really invested into the quantitative finance process here, you put them in the industry and they, again, progress these careers. You have now this bad cycle. We are currently in that bad cycle. And there's a lot of reasons why. One of these is that firms have never really had a desire to bring in a bunch of sciencey people to solve business problems. And there is a valid argument from the business side, which is going to be, we hire people to solve problems. We don't hire people to do self-learning and to do research often. I get it. It's a valid point. And there are many people that have their heads high in the clouds wanting to go on academic ventures. And I won't point to any specific degrees, but there are specific degrees that think the world is more like this and it's fun and rainbows and butterflies. And they're not really driven to generate a profit. And so balancing the scientific academic approach of trying to do things by the book. But also markets aren't perfect. You run into a lot of issues and you do need to make money and come up with answers quickly. It's a balancing act. I don't know what the perfect balance percentage is. I think it changes firm to firm, strategy to strategy. But there's this problem and process here that we're running into in the industry as well. And so a lot of people I see that are CROs, heads of model development, heads of model validation, model risk management, all that, heads of quantitative research, all these teams, often are people that communicate well, and there's a great value to this, and it's needed because you need someone that can pitch, market, and explain quantitative finance to senior management. That's a valid skill set to have for that role. But that being said, it makes it very hard for now you to manage down. You're managing up well, but how do you manage down well unless you've done a lot of the rigorous quant finance stuff and really love that process? And I've seen a lot of people through a career, including myself, which is like, I'm torn of like, do I go up and help more in the industry, or do I stay as an individual contributor, impacting the business through interesting, insightful, work? But again, typically your compensation now is going to be very different as well, where interestingly enough, high compensation doesn't mean more quantitative. It just means more management, more impactful in decision-making, which was rightfully so. But at the same time, it seems like people that are really understanding the deep nuances of the modeling are having a hard time conveying that up to senior management, and senior management typically isn't that quantitative. And so there's this natural break in any sort of quant finance firm or firm utilizing quantitative finance, even if it's like a bank or generic financial institution. So this is something that's just a natural problem. It's not anyone's bad or nasty or anything like that, but somehow this creates some sort of issue. I see many quant teams, departments mismanaged. I see risk management mismanaged because, well, the senior staff isn't really qualified and doesn't really comprehend what's going on through this. And then that entire organization as well, it's hard to find really qualified people because the demand for quants really is high, and the supply of really qualified, well-prepared quants is low because the academic issue with this as well. Now you have the feedback loop, which is now the other broken part of this, which is I see programs that say, hey, we're going to go to our alumni and we're going to get feedback and they're going to help us make the program better. And I look at it, and the alumni that are usually willing to help have this same personality type split and issue. Those that are very quantitative, that love what they do and want to get in the weeds and everything, tend not to want to give back because they don't like dealing with people. I get it. And then on the same token of that, often they will give very odd advice. And it's hard for the business half to take that seriously and understand it because there's actually a political layer in academia and in the industry. I had a problem recently and somebody said, Dimitri, we're just going to gut everybody. We're going to just start over from scratch. And I remember sitting there looking at it like, okay, I've been in management for a while. I can tell you that's not really a solution for whatever problem you're working on. You can't just do that. You have to strategically figure out how to move the pieces and get buy-in from everybody and make changes. And unfortunately, those people that you don't think are qualified, even if they are not qualified, you can't just up and oust an entire division and team and process here. And there's more details I wish I could share, but I can't share. But this is not a good solution. And so on the quant side, that's often what the solution comes to. And in many cases, it's validly so that like there's an issue within the team and you need to do some big changes. But politically, you can't just wave your hands and make problems go away. And also, you tend to run into the same problem second time around. So it always seems like an easy solution. Like, oh, we have, bad employees, professors, whatever. You just oust them all and you get rid of them. And then we just start over and go and find these great people. Finding great people is hard. That's just life in a nutshell, right? Finding a good doctor, a good mechanic, a good, someone to cut your hair, a good, life has skills to it, and it's hard to find people that are good at what they do. It just is. So that's another issue of, the industry giving back creates this sort of issue. Those that are really excited and willing to give back tend to be those in non-quant roles that don't really understand how to make the programs better. And so that creates a lot of issue with, again, this feedback loop, which is like you're generating the students to be practitioners. The practitioners are supposed to be helping the programs get better. And so you kind of have this chicken and egg thing of like, did the programs just fall off the rails and teach outdated material to start with, which now causes, practitioners who aren't stellar, and then those non-stellar practitioners are giving back? Or is it just that, they created great people and then the industry kind of turned them into different things? Or like, it's hard to figure out what's the problem. And I would tell you, in my opinion, I think it's just across the board, we need to, as a whole community, meaning the academic community, the industry practitioners, the firms, and everybody, and all the non-quant people that are around us that we work with, we all need to work together to come up with a better solution of how to standardize a lot of the practices and training and education and performance. And job titling, I wish would just die. I wish we would actually come up with standardized titles and firms would stick to it. And if your firm decides to make up stupid titles or mislabel things, that we would like publicly ostracize you as a ridiculous firm and how, incompetent that company is and make them look stupid. So that people would be like, okay, we've got to stick to more standardized forms. Now, one solution people say is like, oh, we could standardize like actuaries, for example, or like the medical industry. No, I don't think that's a good solution. And that just sets some sort of bare minimum bar, and then you spend a bunch of time training for some sort of exam, and then you pass the exam and you're training to fit some specific type of mold. Quant finance is very big, which is another big problem we have. You could work in all kinds of different products and industries within quantitative finance. Like we always say, buy side, sell side. You have whole types of product lists that go into these, and it becomes quite messy. So it's not as easy as just standardizing an exam or a test or anything like that. But again, I wish academics would specialize in their training and education. I wish the industry would standardize naming. And I wish we would all come to a more cohesive understanding of what quantitative finance is. I wish we would get rid of the stigma of investing is quant finance, because as I point out to many people, historically, that's not true. The term quant was a derogatory term, originally applied to sell-side derivative, people doing the math behind that. So that's why a lot of this, as we talked about, derivative pricing and everyone's like clinging on to it. That's historically where it came from. Now, you could argue Ed Thorpe brought it into the buy side more so, and there was some advances at similar timings and everything if you want. But one of the biggest detrimental stigmas within quant finance is people start talking about salaries, and then they imply that your ranking of salary, of how high your salary is how good of a quant you are. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's actually the inverse. It's kind of like maybe like a sigmoidal curve where you have like a lot of times the best quants are in, maybe it's like a hump, like it goes up, there's a hump and then it flattens out. But often best quants are more focused in doing math and stats, and they're not looking up to like management titles and getting promotions and doing those sorts of things. And often firms have to compensate more for higher stress, worse work environments, lack of stability. Like there's a lot of other things that get priced into the comp part of this. So I don't think comp is relevant. That needs to get thrown out the window. But we should go back to like focusing on skills. That should be the educational piece. That should be the industry piece. What skills do you need for this job? What skills are we training you to make sure you're trained for that job? And let's just focus on the skills part of it. And let's not worry about the titling as much with like salaries and job title and companies and all that. That drives me insane. And then finally, the last part and piece of this is really going to be the lack of risk management in the chase for machine learning, AI, stupidity, and the lack of scientific rigor here. That's a big mouthful. But let me give you kind of a breakdown of what has happened over my career. So people that are older than me can step back further and do a larger perspective on this. But you have, again, the build up to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. There's not a problem. So please don't take that when I start to talk about this as there was a problem. But models were built. A lot of time people point to the Coppola models, not to get too mathematical into the weeds on this. Essentially, more or less, they assumed these default probabilities followed a normal distribution, and Coppolas are multidimensional, and you take two distributions and you stack them to make a three-dimensional, like a mountain of these probabilities, looking at the probability that multiple assets would essentially default at the same time. These models we knew did not fully incorporate what I'm going to say more or less was the serial correlations that increase when you have defaults. This is known from almost any credit practitioner that's a finance person, that when you're in a crisis, when that occurs, all the bad assets tend to correlate together. So you have like a landslide effect. Now, people say it's fat tails and whatever. I think that's mislabeling a lot of the issues, but we're not going to get in the weeds on this. Anyways, there was weak modeling done. It has to do with simplicity. That was done because it's much easier to do that and use a parametric distribution than to use non-parametric methods to try to come up with kernel density estimations and like other approaches for getting non-parametric distributions and putting them into these cross-correlation functions and then stressing them and doing a bunch of other work. Not going to get into that. There were quants that pointed this issue out and said the models are only good in specific situations. So there are people that knew what was happening and understood that and raised the red flags, and the business in many cases was too profit hungry and didn't care. So they were kind of racing to the cliff per se, trying to maximize their profits before something blew up. There was a lot of knowledge around that was happening. Now, that being said, there's also a lot of ignorant people that were not properly trained, that didn't understand the models, didn't understand the math, didn't understand the financial theory, that didn't understand anything that was going on. But again, they were in these roles because, as we talked about, they perhaps were not properly trained and educated. And there's a whole bunch of nuances that go into how the industry works and how finance and economics is vastly, vastly different than other sciences. It's not a hard science. So surprise, quant finance, I would say, is a social science. It is a soft science. Probably upset a lot of quants out there, but it's the reality. Anyways, so there's this misunderstanding on the modeling that created the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Risk management wasn't really a focus. Risk management was managed in silos. So divide risk into specific categories like market risk, credit risk. Like they siloed out their risks, and each department or each pod or each team or each whatever, they managed risks in these silos independent. And the idea was somebody on top would be able to look at the risks and understand the risks. But a lot of it was kind of isolated. There wasn't a lot of understanding of risk across an entire firm. So out of this came the Dodd-Frank Act. And I'm not a huge proponent of regulations for many reasons. But out of this, Dodd-Frank came out, and it came something called CCAR. And a lot of this came out from another letter called SR 11-7, which is the validation letter, explaining how models need to be understood. The weaknesses need to be written in a document. The model monitoring needs to be in the documentation to explain, what's happening. And a lot of this has, I guess, blossomed out of a lot of these documents and out of the rules and everything. And the banks built out a really nice, pretty framework for doing what's called ERM, Enterprise Risk Management. So let's get rid of the silos. Let's make risk management an entire thing. A lot of firms started adding chief risk officers. The Federal Reserve mandated banks do this, for example, but not a lot of financial institutions, especially like hedge funds, do this. And they more or less created a much more cohesive and rigorous process here, because people start to point out like, well, if somebody said the models didn't work in 2007, 2008, why didn't anyone do anything? And it's like, well, there's a whole list of reasons, from profitability and chasing profits to not understanding what they were saying to nobody documented it. So people might've been using models and not known. So this new wave of risk management came out in 2010 with Dodd-Frank, and it had blossomed and built out quite well. I was lucky. I joined the industry in 2014. I rode like the kickstart of it, and I really hit like an upward momentum when firms were really starting to bring in a lot of PhDs and masters in quantitative finance and quant finance related fields like statistics, probability, econometrics, for example. And they brought in all these people, applied math, and they really started to build out this process. One of the big realizations from this, though, is that risk management, there's a lot of it that's not quantitative. Okay? So quants do things very quantitatively, but things quants don't like to do is like write, 80 to 120 page documentations. And people say, oh, that's just, too much. 80 pages for documentation really is not that much for a standard model. I will not get into the details on this. But they did a lot of this documentation. They went through this process, and more or less what happened was model developers built models and worked with the business to solve their problem like quants have always done. SR 11-7 and the whole mandate for model validation came in. And model validation is not you did work, I run work, results are the same. No, it is you go in and you have to have some sort of academic, intellectual, industry-specific challenge to that model development process to come up with whether all the decisions along that model development process were done correctly. And there's a lot of differing opinions and a lot of issues. And I can tell you from experience, often developers will spend months and months and months screwing around with the problem, wrestling with it and coming up with a solution. And then someone would come in on model validation, look at it and go, this was an easy solution. Here's the solution. And development goes, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't see that. I didn't understand that. So model validation added a lot of meat and teeth to the process of like, we need to really manage our risks and understand them. Now, model validation is the quant side of this. There's also the entire rest of ERM, which is the documentation, the tracking, the deadlines. Having, again, I've talked a little bit about the channel, but having like a risk appetite, having risk topology, laying out your risk, doing a risk inventory, tracking what incoming risks come in. Because often the public after a crisis will say like, well, didn't they see this risk coming? And didn't they, like somebody raised a red flag and said something? How come nothing happened? Like, obviously you should have done something, but it's 2020 looking back and realizing like, oh yeah, that was a serious issue. But also there wasn't really risk inventory. Like there weren't people like saying, oh, this is a potential risk. It would fall into these categories. Let's list them out in sort of this documentation going through this process here. So this was huge. This is a big advancement. A lot of the buy side's not doing this. They are behind. I can tell you from looking at the tech industry is significantly further behind on any sort of comprehension of this. And the absolute only reason banks did it was because more or less the Federal Reserve held a gun to their head and said, you will comply and do this. If not, we will fine you or shut you down. So this all occurred, and there's this big thrive and big jump in the quant space. And a lot of this, people call this risk management. Why do we call it risk management if you're building models or doing validation? Because it's a very dirty thing to say we hired a bunch of quants who blew up the financial economy in 2007, 2008, and now we're going to hire a bunch more of them. Like that's the response. So they relabeled it risk management. And what is quantitative finance but risk management? Like I mentioned, derivatives are nothing more than risk management. That's what risk management is just looking at problems and coming up with solutions. Now, again, it goes outside of derivative pricing into credit and market risk and operational risk, and you can break out all types of sorts of modeling, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. You know, sizing of positions, trades, all that. Now, the issue that has occurred from this and what is concerning to me in this whole process that we're talking about is that we have now deregulated a lot of that. So we went from CCAR and it was a very specific size, and banks spent millions and millions of dollars lobbying for politicians to come back and reduce the regulations, and they were going to increase the bar. So I believe the original bar, I think it was $100 billion, maybe it was $50 billion banks and above had to comply with CCAR. You can go look it up. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact number, and then I think it got moved to like 200 or 250 billion. And so that dropped out a bunch of the smaller banks. And then only the really big banks were part of that. And then they called them like, you know, this big globally important banks. And those were the ones that had the most, you know, critical scrutinous process in this whole process here. But as time went on and they reduced this, now they have what's called, I think it's called like HCAR, whatever. Instead of CCAR, there's a horizontal capital assessment review, I think is what it is. They started to dumb this down and they've watered this down. And I experienced this in my career where it was like we were doing really rigorous quantitative work. And then it was like, you know what? The regulations are falling away. We can hire non-quants to do a lot of the work now, like model validations, just like compliance and review. So we can just hire someone with a business degree in undergrad and pay them $60,000 instead of the $150, $160 we were paying. And then we can start to outsource a lot of this to India, which a lot of companies did. I have a big issue with this for many, many reasons, which I won't go into on this video, but they outsourced a lot of it. The quality of the validation significantly dropped. The requirements and the standards of many banks in their validations significantly dropped. And a lot of firms have lost the model validation abilities. It's just gone. A lot of those people that, like me, that were in there doing that, we left because the job was no longer quantitative finance. And so we went and found other opportunities and moved around. Now, a lot of the big banks are still doing it and they still have the same requirements and things going well, but you are kind of hollowing out a lot of the industry here. And in roles, now one of the big issues during this similar time period is ML and AI. So I tell people continuously, machine learning has been used in banking, for example, for a very long time. Like in the 80s, it's been used for fraud detection, like decision tree-based models, right? And it's still being used. So, you know, finance and banks have been doing this for a long time. But there has become more or less a race to the bottom. And we're racing, again, I think more towards that cliff where we're going to fall off again. And this has been one of my big complaints. I've been echoing at some of my conferences and panel discussions and, you know, presentations in general. And what happened is SR 11.7 more late states, you have to understand the principles and the process and the models here. So you have the problem you need to solve, you understand the data, you put the data in, you understand the relationships, the dynamics, how the models work, and you can understand clearly what the output's going to be. Now, even when you use something like a decision tree, which is very easy to understand, and you make the tree too big, it is now much harder to understand from a human to actually logically look at the problem and say, yes, this is working as expected, or no, it's not working. And one of these issues is discrimination or inadvertently combinations of variables creating very odd outputs. Combinations of variables and filtering can create all kinds of issues and challenges in the credit space. Now, what I'm not talking about is we could start going into other sorts of areas in the business, investment, your 401k, pensions, derivative pricing, everything else, and start to go down this, rabbit hole of some of the potential issues that go along with it. Now, as ML has arisen, banks are really wanting to do that, but SR 11.7 forced a lot of the banks, and with AI as well, to do things very methodically. As regulations got decreased, banks started kind of running wild, and then it was, I can squeeze out an extra 5-10% accuracy, which is huge in these sorts of models. And so then firms are kind of upping the ante of using more and more complex, more and more black box models to make some sort of decision. And the argument is we're making more money now, and to stay competitive in the market, we have to do what everyone else is doing. And then what ended up occurring, what's happening with the justification process is people say, I understand the data from an input perspective. Okay. I understand the output. At least I think I understand the output. Like I looked at some cases, they look reasonable. So I understand the input, I understand the output. But the model part, we don't really understand, right? We don't understand this specific specification for this model. But the hand-wavy part now is, but I understand the methodology for that model. But I don't understand that specific model, right? Because there's a specific structure and design. So let's just think about like a decision tree or like a neural network. Like how many layers you have and how many nodes and how it gets crossed and how things get put in, right? Like you can know some of this. But then when you start to logically say, like, you need to understand from a business perspective why the model is set up the way it is, and are the directions correct, and are the meanings correct, and how does the math play out in the end, and what sort of biases and issues does the model end up creating or running into? We can't really answer that because we don't really understand the middle part. And there are tools, and this is where I think quant finance this is where we're missing it. This is the interesting research problem that scientists should be running to. Like, we need to solve this. This is really great. Instead, we've had some hand-wavy approaches to looking at attributions. Like if you have a variable, so data goes in, how many people does that variable affect? What is kind of the weight of the output of that as well? And yeah, we understand it, but you really don't understand it. And so firms have been kind of trying to get rid of the rules and relax and relax and relax. This reminds me now of the copulas in 2007, 2008, right? We need to get more accurate. We're squeezing some accuracy out. The models are actually becoming more rigid and they fail much quicker, and they're a little bit harder to see when they're going to fail and how they're going to fail. And then the amount of monitoring that goes into machine learning models is not great. It's often monitoring accuracy. It's not monitoring other like characteristics in data like stationarity, heteroscedasticity. Maybe there's a bias or some sort of internal bias or change in variance or kurtosis within the data structures. So to give you an example, you can put in the same distribution in a model, and depending on how like a decision tree is actually what's called segmented modeling, different consumers get impacted by different parts of the model. They don't actually get impacted by the entire model structure itself. Depending how that goes into there, and depending how the relationships within that model are changing, the relationships can change between the inputs and the outputs, but the structure could stay the same because it's cast in stone. And then you have people now wanting to update models live and have the models consistently changing and learning through an automated AI approach. But again, there is a lot of risks associated with this. Now we go back to look at 2007, 2008. Copula models were fairly simple. We thought we understood them. We just made the assumption we're going to use normal distributions. What could go wrong? And then a huge crisis happened, a financial crisis, more or less a global financial crisis. But the US took a huge beating on that. And so then the response to that is now we have this AI ML push. We've deregulated. We're not really exploring with the scientific method anymore. We're exploring with just chasing correlations and, doing hand-wavy exercises. And now the people that are doing it don't seem to be as qualified as they should be. And then you have this weird feedback loop, and it's a broken system, right? We're just a broken system with this. So I have been very frustrated because you see how this process is broken and shifts. And of course, when it fails, it's going to be a lot of finger pointing, just like 2007, 2008, just like any other sort of crisis. I mean, even like the Great Depression, people still debate what caused it and how they should have handled it and what would have caused, better results and outcomes and everything else. This is what's going to happen though. And I think we've let our guard down. We've reduced risk management. We don't really care about that. That's not the goal. That's not the focus. We're really excited in saying we're doing research in ML and AI. We're not really doing it though in a very responsible, ethical manner, in a scientific approach. It seems much more like we're just chasing things to chase accuracy and results on this, which is why I've been talking a lot about robustness within modeling and frameworks and setting up risk frameworks and governance and processes and all that. So this is really the nutshell. And to summarize why I think quant finance is dying is because, again, we seem to have abandoned a lot of the scientific methods, both in the educational perspective, in the professional perspective, and even in this current AI ML wave, we've seemed to be throwing things just out the window with it. And then to make matters worse, we have kind of ruined the term quantitative finance as a whole. Some jobs having that title are something as simple as, business analytics or maybe just general finance, and we're rebranding and labeling that. And then you have people that are doing really high-end, complex, interesting, rigorous quant finance. And so again, it's not that we just don't do it or that's not there. Like, there is a really solid core quant finance group, but it's hard to figure out who's doing what and how they're doing it. And there's a lot of secrecy across the industry as well, which is another big frustration of mine. And so we kind of have this shattered, broken system here, and I don't know how you get it back on the rails. So this is why I think quant finance is dying. There doesn't seem to be a core group of people interested in fixing this and getting it back on the rails. I don't think you can give it to one group either. I don't think you can say academia needs to fix it. The industry needs to fix it. It's hard to figure out where these pieces go together and how it's working out. And I don't know who's going to fix this. And this has been my big frustration, and part of the goal of my channel over the years is how do you get some consistency? How do we bring more people into the conversation? How do we grow a more robust, insightful, quantitative finance community? And part of that is inclusion and bringing people in and having interesting discussions. But part of this is upholding definitions and standards and not just letting everybody in and labeling everybody as a quant and throwing out standards and metrics and ethics and morals out the window with this entire process here. So in a nutshell, that is why I think quant finance is dying. I would love to have people join in on these conferences I throw, come on the podcast talking about these issues. How do you solve them? How do we build a better, stronger community? How do we go about addressing all these sorts of issues in a whole? And then the last point here, which I missed with this, is going to be the issue of regulation. I'm not a big fan of having government mandate things. That doesn't tend to make things better. But, so hear me out. I do think there needs to be some sort of government enforcement within this space, because as everybody's chasing more accurate models in that case of ML and AI as we're going, the profit is driving everyone to make riskier and riskier and riskier decisions chasing profits. Okay. Now, government intervention, I think, is needed to prevent this because this is not really a free market. I would be fine if everyone chased it and chased it and chased it, but when it blew up, everybody that's going to fall out has to fall out. Now, the consequences of that would be enormous. And that is the argument with the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And that's going to be, we should have let the banks fail, because that would have taught everybody a lesson that we need to have proper risk management, because now you really took a beating, right? You took a financial loss. And the economy would have floundered for a very long period, I believe, at least in my opinion. And that would have made a much longer, painful, lasting contribution. The problem with that is that some people made bad decisions which would impact the entire economy. The average person doing working jobs that is not in the finance community would have paid a high price as well. So that's where I think the government piece has to come in at some point, because we're not going to let them fail. And even if they do fail, so this is another point, even if you run a firm, you maximize your personal profits, which is what everybody does, and then you blow the firm up, and of course, it's not one person, it's the whole industry making poor decisions, trying to beat each other out on these accuracy pieces. At the end of it, right, when it all goes into flames and it burns, it's like a phoenix. It has to come out of the ashes. Who's going to run the finance industry? The same people that blew it up, because there's no one else that understands the finance industry as well as the people that were in finance that blew it up to start with. But we didn't learn the lesson. And because of that, I'm very frustrated with the industry. Big names, big companies, banks. I see a lot of mergers going on now too, which has been frustrating because I think we're consolidating the risk and the practices to doing more or less one overly concentrated thing. Like too big to fail was a thing in 2007, 2008. We're just creating that problem again currently with some of the mergers and acquisitions and things that are going on. Same with tech. Again, it's too big and too concentrated with this. But you have this issue of government, which government does bailouts and this guarantees some sort of safety net. And so poor decisions continually get made within that process. So anyways, back to my original conclusion. We need to bring everybody in as a bigger community with this. I think another problem I see is everybody wants to welcome everybody into. I see a lot of channels and people and practitioners saying like, we're going to take all these people that want to be in the industry and we're going to figure out how to make them fit. There are a lot of people that aren't cut out to do it. I'm sorry. You're just not cut out for quant finance. If you're not cut out for it, we shouldn't be forcing people in and lowering standards and bars to bring them in as well. But we need to come together as a community. We need to talk more. We need to challenge more. And risk management needs to be a bigger focus and realize that quant finance is risk management. You chase profits and you get paid a profit because there is a risk tied to it. Risks and profits are the same thing. Doing a profit-seeking venture without looking at the risk is just irresponsible. So anyways, that is why I think quant finance is dying. I think we have fallen away from the scientific method. I think the academic institutions are falling by the wayside. I think a lot of the industry as well, most of you only have 20 to 30-year careers. You'll face one, maybe two financial crises and you're already out smooth sailing and doing your own thing. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of involvement. And I think the way to solve this is just through discussion, conferences, debates, chats, and challenges across the industry. So that's why I think quant finance is broken. That's kind of how I think we should solve it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you found this video helpful and be a part of this community. Anyways, I'll see you next time.